Charlotte McBride had been crawling through 3 feet of Montana snow for what felt like hours, her bare feet leaving bloody tracks behind her in the white powder, her nightdress frozen stiff against her skeletal frame. And when she finally collapsed against the split rail fence of the Thornton Ranch, she could no longer remember if she was running towards something or away from it, only that the cold had stopped hurting, and that meant death was close now. The rancher found her at first light, curled beneath his porch like a wounded animal. Her lips blue, her fingers black with frostbite, her eyes open but seeing nothing. And when he lifted her weightless body, she did not make a sound because there was nothing left inside her to make sounds with anymore. She had been barefoot in the snow, barefoot and alone, and though he would not learn the full story for days, the tracks told him enough. She had walked miles through the February blizzard of 1879, a girl who could not have been more than 16, barefoot and desperate, and so far past the point of survival that finding her alive seemed less like luck and more like something the mountains had decided on their own. The lonely rancher had lived by himself for 7 years since his wife died, bringing their stillborn son into the world. And he had learned to accept loneliness the way a man accepts scars. But when he carried that barefoot girl into his cabin and laid her by the fire, he understood that some things arrive not by choice, but by necessity, that some responsibilities choose you rather than the other way around, and that the West had a way of answering questions you did not know you were asking. If you need stories that strip away everything comfortable and show you what people become when survival demands impossible choices, subscribe now, because this barefoot girl and this lonely rancher are about to discover that mercy and danger often wear the same face. The rancher's name was Daniel Thornton, and he was 43 years old, a man who had fought for the Union and come west afterward, because the war had taught him that crowds of people brought out the worst in humanity, and he preferred the company of cattle and silence. His ranch sat in a high valley 15 miles from the nearest settlement, a place where winter came early and stayed late, where a man could go months without seeing another soul. And he had built that isolation deliberately because it was the only way he knew to keep the darkness in his head from spilling out onto others. When the barefoot girl began to wake 3 days after he found her, her first words were not gratitude, but terror. And she thrashed so violently against his attempts to help that he had to hold her down while she screamed accusations he did not understand. Words about a preacher and a cellar, and things that should have stayed buried. Her name was Charlotte McBride, and she was 17 years old, though she looked younger because hunger had carved her down to nothing but bones and eyes. And when she finally calmed enough to speak in sentences instead of fragments, she told him a story that made the lonely rancher understand why she had been barefoot in the snow, why she had chosen death by freezing over whatever she had left behind. She had been living with her uncle, a traveling preacher named Silas McBride, who had taken her in after her parents died of scarlet fever 2 years earlier. And what should have been salvation had become a different kind of death, the kind that happens behind locked doors and leaves no visible marks. The barefoot girl did not give him details, and the rancher did not ask for them, because some things do not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. And when she finally fell silent, and looked at him with eyes that expected nothing good from any man ever again. He simply nodded and said she could stay until spring thaw if she wanted, that he had a spare room and no expectations, that she was safe here, if anywhere in this world could be called safe. The first weeks were strange and careful. Two damaged people learning to exist in the same space without inflicting more damage. Charlotte moved like a ghost through his cabin, barely eating, never speaking unless spoken to first. And at night, the rancher would hear her crying through the thin walls, sounds that reminded him of wounded animals he had put down out of mercy during the war. Her feet had suffered badly from the barefoot journey through the snow. 3 toes on her left foot, black with frostbite that he knew would have to come off if infection set in. And he tended to them with the same patient care he would give to a newborn calf, wrapping them in clean cloth soaked in whiskey, keeping her by the fire, watching for signs of rot. She never thanked him, and he never expected thanks because he understood that trust was not something you could ask for, only something you could earn through consistency and time. And so he simply continued doing what needed to be done while the barefoot girl slowly decided whether she wanted to live or not. Montana in February was brutal that year, the worst winter anyone could remember, with temperatures dropping so low that trees split open in the night and cattle froze standing up in the fields. And the lonely rancher found himself grateful for the isolation because it meant no one would come asking questions about the barefoot girl. No one would demand explanations he did not want to give. The preacher came looking for her in March, when the snow had melted enough to make the mountain roads passable again. Daniel was mending a fence line when he saw the wagon approaching, and he knew before it even stopped who it was and why he had come, because Charlotte had gone white as bone when she spotted it from the cabin window. And when he walked back to meet the visitor, she was already hiding in the root cellar, like the barefoot girl she had been when she arrived. Silas McBride was a tall man with the kind of face people called distinguished, silver hair and clear eyes, and a voice that could fill a tent with the word of God. And he greeted the lonely rancher with a smile that did not reach past his teeth, and asked if he had seen a troubled young girl who had run away from his care. During a moment of confusion, the rancher looked at this man who called himself holy and saw something else entirely. Saw the same emptiness he had seen in the eyes of men during the war, who had discovered they enjoyed killing. And he understood in that moment that whatever Charlotte had run from, she had been right to run barefoot through snow and death rather than stay one more day under this man's roof. He told the preacher he had not seen any girl, that he lived alone and preferred it that way, that strangers were not welcome this far into the mountains. And Silas McBride smiled again and said he understood completely. But if the rancher happened to see a barefoot young woman, he should know she was not well in her mind, that she told lies about good Christian men, that she needed to be returned to proper care before she hurt herself or someone else. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it changed everything because the lonely rancher understood that simply keeping Charlotte hidden was not going to be enough, that the preacher would not stop looking, that men like Silas McBride believed they owned the people they hurt and would pursue them to the ends of the earth rather than let them escape. After the wagon disappeared back down the mountain road, Daniel went to the root cellar and found Charlotte curled in the corner among the preserved vegetables, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes wide and empty as a doll's. And he told her quietly that the man was gone, but that he would be back, that they needed to decide what they were going to do, because hiding forever was not a plan. She looked at him then, with something he had not seen in her face before, a flicker of will behind the fear, and she asked him why he was helping her, why a lonely rancher who did not know her and owed her nothing would risk trouble with a man of God for the sake of some barefoot girl who might be exactly as crazy as the preacher claimed. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, remembering his wife, remembering the way she had looked at him with that same desperate hope when the labor went wrong and he could not save her, could not save their son, could do nothing but watch them both slip away while he stood useless and guilty. And he said, because everyone deserves one person who believes them, because the world has enough people who look away from hard truths, because he had looked away once before and it had cost him everything that mattered. Stop here and tell me this. If you were Charlotte, could you trust a lonely rancher you barely knew with your life? Or would the barefoot terror of running again feel safer than the risk of believing in one more man who promised protection? Drop your answer in the comments. Spring came slowly to Montana that year, and with it came a kind of cautious peace between the rancher and the barefoot girl who was learning to be something other than a victim. Charlotte began to eat more, to speak without being spoken to first, to move through the cabin like someone who belonged there, rather than someone who expected to be thrown out at any moment. Her feet healed, though she lost 2 toes on the left foot and would walk with a slight limp for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder of the barefoot journey that had brought her to this lonely ranch and this quiet man who had chosen to see her as human rather than property. She learned to help with the ranch work, to milk the cows and feed the chickens and mend the things that needed mending. And Daniel taught her to shoot because he said every person living this far from town needed to be able to protect themselves, though they both knew he was really teaching her to protect herself from a specific threat, from a preacher who believed God had given him ownership of a young girl's body and soul. The lessons continued through April and into May, and Charlotte proved to be a quick study, her hands steady on the rifle, her eyes clear when she sighted down the barrel, and the lonely rancher watched her transformation from barefoot broken thing into someone capable of standing her ground, and felt something he had not felt in 7 years, something that might have been hope, or might have been the dangerous belief that broken people could be mended if they found the right place to heal. The preacher came back in June with 3 men from his congregation, men who believed they were doing righteous work by helping recover a lost lamb who needed guidance back to the fold. They arrived at midday when Daniel was working in the north pasture, and Charlotte was alone at the cabin when they knocked on the door with hands that had already decided not to take no for an answer. She saw them coming through the window, and her first instinct was to run again, to go barefoot into the mountains one more time. But then she remembered the rifle lessons and the quiet rancher who had said everyone deserves one person who believes them. And instead of running, she picked up the Winchester that Daniel kept loaded by the door, and she stepped out onto the porch to meet the men who had come to take her back to hell, disguised as salvation. Silas McBride was in front, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, his voice already beginning the speech about God's will and a child's duty and the sin of rebellion. But Charlotte raised the rifle and pointed it at his chest and told him in a voice that did not shake that he could turn around and leave, or he could die on this lonely ranch where nobody would ask questions about what happened to a traveling preacher and his friends. The men with him looked uncertain, looking to their preacher for guidance, and Silas smiled that cold smile and said she would not shoot, that she was a confused child playing with things she did not understand, that he knew her better than she knew herself, and she did not have the strength to pull that trigger. He was wrong. Charlotte McBride, who had been barefoot and broken and ready to die in the snow, rather than spend one more day under his control, pulled the trigger and put a bullet through Silas McBride's right shoulder. And when he fell screaming into the dirt, she worked the lever action and pointed the rifle at the next man and asked if anyone else wanted to test whether she understood what she was doing. The men grabbed their wounded preacher and loaded him into the wagon and were gone within minutes, leaving nothing behind but blood in the dust and the sharp smell of gunpowder, and a barefoot girl who was shaking now that it was over, but who had not run, had not hidden, had stood her ground and chosen violence over victimhood, because sometimes that is the only choice that makes any sense. When Daniel returned an hour later and found Charlotte sitting on the porch steps with the rifle across her knees and blood on her hands, he did not ask what happened, because the evidence was clear enough, and he simply sat down beside her and said, "You did what you had to do." And she nodded and said, "Yes, I did." And they sat together in silence while the sun moved across the sky, and the lonely rancher understood that he had not saved this barefoot girl at all, that she had saved herself, that all he had done was provide a place safe enough for her to remember she had the strength to fight back. The summer passed without further visits from the preacher or his congregation, and Charlotte began to laugh sometimes, a sound that startled both of them the first time it happened, because neither had thought laughter was possible anymore. She planted a garden behind the cabin, rows of vegetables that she tended with the same fierce determination she brought to everything, and the lonely rancher watched her work in the Montana sun and thought about his wife, about the child they never had, about the 7 years he had spent alone in these mountains, because he believed isolation was the only way to survive grief. Charlotte was not his daughter and would never be his daughter, but she was something, some kind of family that neither of them had chosen, but that had formed anyway out of necessity and loneliness, and the shared understanding that broken people recognize each other in ways that whole people never do. In August, she asked him if she could stay permanently, if there was enough work on the ranch to justify keeping her on, and he said there was always work on a ranch this size, that he could use the help, that she had earned her place here a dozen times over, and he would be grateful for the company if she wanted to stay. She nodded and did not say anything else, but that night he heard her crying again through the walls, except this time the sounds were different, not the wounded animal sounds of those first weeks, but something else, something that might have been relief or release. The sound of someone finally believing they had found a place they did not have to run from anymore. The first snow came early that year, in late September, and when Charlotte saw it falling, she stood at the window for a long time, watching the white powder cover the ground, remembering another snow and another time when she had been barefoot and dying, and certain that the world held nothing for her except more pain. The lonely rancher came and stood beside her, and asked if the snow bothered her, if it brought back memories she would rather forget, and she shook her head and said no. The snow was beautiful now, that it meant something different than it used to, that every time she saw it, she would remember that she had walked through death barefoot and come out the other side alive. They stood together, watching the Montana winter begin again. The rancher and the girl who was not his daughter, but who had become his family anyway. Two people who had been broken by the world and who had found each other in the mountains, where lonely ranchers sheltered barefoot girls, and the West answered at dawn with violence or mercy, or sometimes both at once. And neither of them knew what the future would bring, but they knew they would face it together. And for people who had lost everything that had ever mattered to them, that knowledge was enough. The moral frontier does not offer easy answers, only hard choices between bad options and worse ones. And if you found truth in this story of a barefoot girl and a lonely rancher who chose to see her humanity when everyone else saw property, then hit that like button, leave a comment about the choices that define us, and subscribe, because these stories of the West are never truly finished. They simply pause long enough for us to catch our breath before the next dawn arrives with its own impossible questions and its own terrible prices.